The security guards were dragging me away from the community pool, while my 8-year-old son Tommy was still in his swim trunks, shivering and confused on the concrete deck. All because Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed pool committee chairwoman, decided a disabled veteran using too much of the facility was disrupting her perfect little aquatic kingdom. Picture this. I'm being escorted off the property like some kind of criminal while my kid asks why the mean lady made daddy leave. And all I'd done was help 3 elderly residents with their water aerobics routine that morning. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if some power-hungry neighbor targeted you and your family during a peaceful day at the pool? And where are you watching from? I want to see how many of you have dealt with community pool politics and the petty tyrants who think they run them. Let me paint you the full picture of how we got to that humiliating moment. My name is Marcus Rivera, 34 years old, Army veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED blast in Kandahar left me with a prosthetic left leg and a medical retirement that ended my military career at 29, after months of physical therapy and learning to walk again. My doctor recommended swimming as the best low-impact exercise for rebuilding strength and managing the chronic pain that comes with losing a limb in service to your country. My son Tommy, 8 years old and full of endless energy, had been my motivation through the darkest days of recovery. When other kids stared at my prosthetic, Tommy would proudly tell them his dad was a hero who fought bad guys overseas. When I struggled with depression and phantom limb pain, Tommy would sit by my hospital bed and read me stories about brave soldiers who never gave up. After my wife Lisa died in a car accident 2 years ago, Tommy and I became an inseparable team of 2. Facing the world together, the Sunset Springs Community Pool was supposed to be our fresh start. When we moved into the planned community 6 months ago, the real estate agent had emphasized the resort-style amenities, especially the Olympic-sized pool with its accessible entry ramp and designated lap lanes. For a disabled veteran trying to rebuild his life while raising a son alone, it seemed perfect. The monthly homeowner fees were steep at $240, but the community promised family-friendly activities and inclusive facilities that would give Tommy friends and give me the therapeutic exercise I needed. Those first few weeks were exactly what we'd hoped for. Tommy made friends with other kids in the neighborhood, and I started a daily routine of swimming laps at 6 a.m. before work, then returning in the evenings to help Tommy with his swimming lessons. The exercise was rebuilding muscle strength I'd lost during months of recovery, and the routine gave us both something positive to focus on after the chaos of military discharge and Lisa's death. I even started helping some of the elderly residents who struggled with their water aerobics routines. Mrs. Patterson, 78 years old and recovering from hip replacement surgery, needed assistance getting in and out of the pool safely. Mr. Rodriguez, a Vietnam veteran with arthritis, appreciated having someone who understood military service help him with his physical therapy exercises. These weren't formal arrangements, just neighbors helping neighbors the way communities are supposed to work. That's when Karen Whitfield decided I was a problem that needed solving. Karen, 52 years old, was a woman who'd never worked outside the home but treated the pool committee like it was the Pentagon. She had perfectly styled auburn hair that never seemed to get wet despite spending hours at the poolside, designer sunglasses that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon of mass destruction. She drove a white Mercedes SUV that she parked across 2 spaces, and she'd been running the pool committee with an iron fist for 7 years, unopposed because apparently nobody else wanted to spend their retirement micromanaging pool usage. Schedules. The Sunset Springs Pool Committee managed what they called facility optimization for 127 homes, with detailed rules about guest policies, equipment usage, and time limits that read like military regulations without any of the logic. Karen had assembled a board of 3 other bored housewives who rubber-stamped her every suggestion, From banning pool noodles during peak hours to requiring advance reservations for lane swimming, the first sign of trouble came 3 weeks into our routine. Karen approached me during Tommy's swimming lesson with her signature fake smile at her ever-present clipboard. "Mr. Rivera," she announced, not asking permission to interrupt our family time, "I've been observing your pool usage patterns, and there are some concerns about policy compliance." I explained that we were just using the facilities we paid for, that I was helping elderly residents as any good neighbor would, and that everything we did fell within the posted community guidelines. Her response was immediate and telling. "The pool committee has discretionary authority over facility access, and we're seeing some patterns that suggest you're treating this like a private rehabilitation center rather than a shared community resource." That's when she pulled out a laminated document I'd never seen before, titled Sunset Springs Aquatic Facility Extended Usage Guidelines, dated just 2 weeks prior. According to these new rules, residents could only use the pool for 90 minutes per day, couldn't assist other residents without pool committee authorization, and couldn't engage in therapeutic activities that might interfere with recreational usage. Tommy, who'd been listening from the pool edge, spoke up with the honesty. "That only comes from kids. My dad helps people because he's nice. Why is that wrong?" Karen's smile never wavered, but her voice got that sharp edge that adults use when they're about to say something cruel. "Sweetie, sometimes grown-ups have to make rules that children don't understand. Your daddy needs to follow the same rules as everyone else." When I pointed out that these guidelines weren't in our original homeowner packet and asked to see the community vote that approved them, Karen's professional mask slipped for the first time. Her face flushed red, and that clipboard started trembling in her hands like she was trying not to explode. "I've been managing this facility since before you decided to move your problems into our peaceful community," she said, the prejudice leaking out like water through a cracked dam. "We have standards here that maybe military people don't understand." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been doing her water aerobics nearby, stopped mid-exercise and stared. Mr. Rodriguez, floating on his back during his therapy routine, actually stood up in the shallow end. Even Tommy seemed to understand that something very wrong had just been said. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest, "I served this country for 8 years, lost my leg defending your freedom to say ignorant things, and I'm raising my son to respect community rules. But I won't be lectured about standards by someone who just made up rules to target my family." Karen's response was swift and vindictive. "We'll see about that. The pool committee has enforcement authority, and repeated violations will result in facility suspension." She stormed toward the pool house, her heels clicking against the wet concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown timer. That evening, an official notice appeared in our mailbox. Pool Facility Violation Notice Number 1, cited excessive daily usage, unauthorized assistance to other residents, and failure to comply with facility guidelines. The penalty was a written warning, but it noted that 3 violations would result in pool access suspension for the remainder of the calendar year. Tommy read the notice over my shoulder as I stood in our kitchen, trying to process how helping elderly neighbors had become a punishable offense. "Dad," he said quietly, "are we in trouble for being nice?" Looking at my son's confused face, I realized that Karen Whitfield had just made the biggest mistake of her appointed life. She'd picked a fight with a combat veteran who'd learned that bullies only understand one language: overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. "Nobody," I said, folding the violation notice carefully. "We're not in trouble. But I think it's time we learned exactly who's really running this pool and whether they have the authority to push around families who've already sacrificed enough." The next morning, I woke up at 0530 hours out of habit, the same time I'd been getting up for 8 years in the Army. Tommy was still asleep in his race car bed, clutching the stuffed eagle his mom had given him before she died. The violation notice sat on my kitchen counter like a piece of evidence waiting for analysis, and I found myself approaching it the way I used to approach intelligence briefings in Afghanistan, methodically, looking for patterns and weaknesses. My name is Marcus Rivera, but most people who knew me before the injury called me Sergeant Rivera. I'd enlisted straight out of high school in Tucson, Arizona, where I'd grown up in a working-class family that believed in service, sacrifice, and standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. My father, Roberto Rivera, had worked construction for 30 years and taught me that a man's worth was measured by his willingness to help others, especially when it cost him something. My mother, Elena, had cleaned houses to put food on our table and always said that dignity wasn't something you could buy or sell. It was something you earned by treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances. The Army gave me purpose and structure that I'd never found in civilian life. I specialized in logistics and supply chain management, which meant I was the guy who made sure soldiers in remote outposts had everything they needed to complete their missions and come home alive. It required attention to detail, systematic thinking, and the ability to work under pressure while managing complex moving parts. Skills that would prove more valuable than I realized when dealing with suburban bureaucracy. My wife Lisa had been my anchor through 2 deployments. She'd met me during my first leave, a kindergarten teacher with endless patience for both 5-year-olds and soldiers dealing with combat stress. Lisa had this way of organizing everything around her, from her classroom supplies to our household finances, with color-coded systems that made chaos manageable. She'd kept detailed records of everything: Tommy's developmental milestones, our mortgage payments, even my medical appointments during recovery. After she died, I'd inherited her methodical approach to documentation, though I'd never imagined I'd need it for pool politics. Tommy had been 4 when I deployed for my second tour, old enough to understand that Daddy was going away to help people, but too young to understand why bad guys wanted to hurt soldiers who were trying to help. He'd grown up hearing bedtime stories about brave soldiers who protected families, and he'd been so proud when other kids asked about my uniform and family photos. After the IED explosion, when I came home with a prosthetic leg and months of physical therapy ahead, Tommy had appointed himself my personal cheerleader and motivation coach. The injury itself had been a random piece of bad luck that changed everything in 3 seconds. I'd been leading a convoy delivering medical supplies to a rural clinic when the roadside bomb detonated under our lead vehicle. The explosion killed my driver, Specialist James Morrison, 19 years old, from Oregon, and left me with a shattered left leg that couldn't be saved despite 3 surgeries and 8 months of hoping. The physical recovery was brutal, but the emotional adjustment was worse. Learning to walk again, dealing with phantom limb pain, and accepting that the career I'd planned to retire from was over at 29. Lisa had been my rock through the darkest period of recovery. She'd researched prosthetic technology, driven me to every appointment, and celebrated small victories like walking to the mailbox or climbing stairs without assistance. When depression hit during those long months of rehabilitation, she'd remind me that Tommy needed to see his father as a fighter, not a victim. She'd been the one who suggested swimming as therapy, finding the local YMCA with accessible facilities, and encouraging me to start with just floating in the shallow end until my strength returned. Her death 2 years later had been the kind of random tragedy that makes you question everything you believed about fairness and purpose. A drunk driver, running a red light at 2:30 in the afternoon, ending the life of someone who dedicated herself to helping others. Tommy had been at school when it happened, and I'd had to pick him up and explain that Mommy wasn't coming home, watching my 6-year-old son's world collapse, the way mine had in that hospital room. We'd moved to Sunset Springs 6 months ago because I'd thought a fresh start in a family-friendly community would help us both heal. The pool had been a major selling point, not just for recreation but for the therapeutic exercise I needed to maintain mobility and manage chronic pain. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Sandra Mitchell, had emphasized the community's commitment to inclusivity and family activities. She'd specifically mentioned the accessible pool facilities and the active senior population who appreciated having younger families in the neighborhood. The moving process had been complicated by my disability rating and the various benefits that came with it. The VA provided a housing allowance that helped with the mortgage, but navigating the paperwork required the same systematic approach I'd used for military logistics. Tommy had helped by organizing boxes with the color-coded system his mother had taught him, turning our relocation into a game where everything had its proper place and purpose. Our first few weeks in Sunset Springs had felt like the fresh start we'd needed. Tommy made friends with the Rodriguez twins next door, and their father Miguel turned out to be a Marine veteran who understood something about adjusting to civilian life. The neighborhood barbecues were friendly, and people seemed genuinely welcoming when they learned about my service. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman with hip problems, had immediately adopted us as her honorary family, bringing casseroles and offering to babysit when I had VA appointments. The pool routine had started naturally. My morning swims became meditation in motion, the repetitive strokes and controlled breathing helping manage both physical pain and emotional stress. Tommy's afternoon swimming lessons gave him confidence and provided structure to our days. When I started helping elderly residents with their water exercises, it felt like finding purpose again, using my strength to help people who reminded me of my own grandparents. Mr. Rodriguez, the Vietnam veteran with arthritis, had been particularly grateful for assistance with his physical therapy routine. At 71, he'd been struggling with exercises his doctor had prescribed, and having someone who understood military service made the difference between compliance and giving up. We developed an informal schedule where I'd help him through his range of motion exercises while Tommy played with other kids in the shallow. And Mrs. Patterson's situation was more complex. Her hip replacement surgery had left her afraid of falling, and the pool's accessible entry ramp required confidence she'd lost after months of limited mobility. I'd started by simply being present while she entered the water, then gradually helping her work through the movements her physical therapist had recommended. Within 3 weeks, she'd gone from fearful shuffling to confident water walking, and her improvement had been noticed by other residents dealing with their own mobility challenges. These weren't formal arrangements or business transactions. They were neighbors helping neighbors, the kind of community interaction that makes suburban living worthwhile. I'd grown up watching my father help elderly neighbors with yard work and my mother check on widowed women in our apartment complex. Service didn't end when you left the military. It just took different forms. The pool committee's intervention had felt like a personal attack disguised as policy enforcement. Karen Whitfield's obvious hostility toward my helping other residents suggested something deeper than concern about facility management. When she'd mentioned military people not understanding standards, the prejudice had been unmistakable, and I'd recognized the tone from civilians who viewed veterans as problems rather than assets. That morning, staring at the violation notice, while Tommy slept peacefully upstairs, I realized that Karen Whitfield had made a tactical error. She'd assumed that a disabled veteran with a young son would be vulnerable to bureaucratic intimidation, that we'd comply with arbitrary rules rather than fight back. What she didn't understand was that the Army had taught me to identify enemy positions, analyze their weaknesses, and develop strategies that turned apparent disadvantages into winning advantages. Tommy wandered into the kitchen in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking about breakfast. As I made his favorite pancakes, I decided that Karen's pool committee was about to face an opponent who'd learned warfare from professionals, who understood the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured power, and who had nothing left to lose except his son's respect. Karen Whitfield arrived at the pool that Tuesday morning like a general inspecting troops, clipboard in hand, her three-person entourage trailing behind her with the enthusiasm of people who'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a pristine white tennis outfit that had never seen actual tennis and oversized sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. Her Mercedes was parked in the handicapped space closest to the pool entrance, despite the obvious absence of any disability placard or license plate. I was helping Tommy practice his backstroke technique when Karen's voice cut across the water like a drill sergeant addressing recruits. "Pool committee inspection," she announced. To no one in particular, though her eyes were fixed directly on me. "We're documenting facility usage patterns and ensuring compliance with community standards." Her inspection team consisted of 3 women who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club magazine. There was Margaret Sutton, 47 years old, with platinum blonde hair sprayed into submission and a permanent expression of mild disgust, as if she constantly smelled something unpleasant. Her husband owned a chain of auto dealerships, and she treated every interaction like a customer service complaint waiting to happen. Behind her walked Jennifer Walsh, a 39-year-old real estate agent who dressed like she was always on her way to show million-dollar homes, complete with stiletto heels that clicked against the pool deck with military precision. The third member was Diane Foster, 55 years old, whose main qualification seemed to be agreeing with whatever Karen said while taking photographs with an expensive camera. Karen had been the undisputed ruler of Sunset Springs Aquatic Kingdom for 7 years, ever since she'd moved into the neighborhood's most expensive house on Pinnacle Drive. Her husband, Richard Whitfield, was a pharmaceutical sales manager who traveled constantly, leaving Karen with unlimited time to micromanage community affairs and an unlimited credit card to fund her suburban power fantasies. She'd transformed the simple community pool from a neighborhood gathering place into her personal fiefdom, complete with laminated rules, scheduled inspections, and enforcement protocols that would make a prison warden proud. The pool committee had started as a volunteer group to coordinate basic maintenance and organize summer activities for families. Under Karen's leadership, it had evolved into something resembling a homeowners association tribunal with the power to fine residents, suspend pool privileges, and make life miserable for anyone who questioned her authority. She'd written a 47-page aquatic facility management manual that covered everything from approved flotation devices to acceptable conversation volume levels. Her committee meetings were held in the community center every first Tuesday of the month, but attendance had dwindled to just Karen's inner circle after she'd started requiring advance notice for any questions or concerns. The minutes from these meetings, which Karen distributed to all homeowners, read like corporate policy. Documents filled with bureaucratic language about facility optimization and user experience enhancement. What they really documented was Karen's systematic elimination of anything that made the pool feel like a community space rather than a private club. The pool rules had multiplied under Karen's reign like some kind of bureaucratic cancer. Original guidelines about basic safety and courtesy had expanded into detailed regulations about guest policies, equipment restrictions, and time limits that seemed designed to discourage usage rather than encourage it. Residents were now required to sign in and out using a logbook that Karen personally reviewed, and she'd installed security cameras to monitor compliance with her ever-expanding list of prohibited activities. Her enforcement style was surgical in its precision and personal in its targeting. Karen had a remarkable ability to identify residents who wouldn't fight back and focus her regulatory attention on their families. Single mothers got cited for allowing children to play too loudly. Elderly residents received violations for staying in the pool longer than posted time limits. Renters found themselves subject to guest restrictions that didn't apply to homeowners. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Karen used her committee position to establish social hierarchy disguised as policy enforcement. The pool facility itself was impressive enough to justify the high homeowner fees we all paid. The Olympic-sized main pool featured 8 lanes for lap swimming, a separate shallow area for children and elderly residents, and an accessible entry ramp that had supposedly been installed to comply with ADA requirements. Adjacent to the main pool was a smaller therapeutic pool with heated water and jets, perfect for physical therapy and low-impact exercise. The entire complex was surrounded by manicured landscaping, comfortable seating areas, and a modern pool house with changing rooms and storage facilities. Karen's personal office occupied a corner of the pool house, complete with file cabinets full of resident documentation, a computer system for tracking usage patterns, and a wall of laminated signs explaining various rules and regulations. She decorated the space like a corporate executive suite, with motivational posters about teamwork and excellence that felt completely disconnected from the reality of pool committee operations. A large window provided a clear view of the entire facility, allowing Karen to monitor activities while maintaining the illusion of professional administration. Her daily routine followed a predictable pattern that resembled military patrol schedules. Karen arrived each morning at precisely 8:30 a.m., unlocked her office, and spent 30 minutes reviewing the previous day's usage logs and security camera footage. She'd then conduct what she called facility assessment walks, circling the pool area with her clipboard and documenting any violations or concerns. Residents learned to time their pool usage to avoid Karen's inspection periods, which only reinforced her sense of authority and control. The committee's monthly budget meetings revealed the extent of Karen's financial influence over pool operations. Despite collecting substantial fees from all 127 homeowners, the pool budget was always strained by what Karen described as necessary improvements and maintenance costs. Detailed line items showed payments to various contractors and service providers, though residents who questioned these expenses were told that competitive bidding information was confidential to protect vendor relationships. Karen's relationship with the broader homeowners association was strategically managed to maintain her independence while avoiding oversight. She'd convinced the HOA board that pool management required specialized expertise, and they'd granted the pool committee autonomous authority over facility operations. This arrangement, that Karen's decisions couldn't be appealed to the larger community, and residents with complaints had no recourse except through her own committee structure. Her targeting of my family had started subtly, with observations about our usage patterns and informal suggestions about alternative exercise options. When I'd continued helping elderly residents with their water therapy, Karen's approach had become more direct, culminating in the violation notice that cited non-existent regulations and threatened suspension of our pool privileges. The escalation felt personal rather than procedural, and her comment about military people not understanding standards had revealed the prejudice driving her enforcement decisions. The morning inspection was clearly designed as intimidation theater, with Karen's team taking photographs of residents and timing their activities with stopwatches. Tommy asked quietly why the mean lady was taking pictures of him swimming, and I realized that Karen had crossed a line that went beyond petty bureaucracy into harassment of children. Mrs. Patterson, who was attempting her water walking routine in the shallow end, looked visibly nervous as Diane Foster documented her movements with the camera. When Karen approached our lane with her clipboard raised like a weapon, I could see the satisfaction in her expression as she prepared to deliver what she thought would be the final blow to our pool privileges. Her mistake was assuming that a disabled veteran with a young son would be intimidated by suburban power plays and manufactured authority. What she didn't realize was that the Army had taught me to recognize the difference between legitimate leadership and bullying disguised as management, and I'd learned that the best way to defeat a bully was to expose the weakness beneath their Apparent strength. Karen Whitfield was about to discover that her pool committee empire was built on foundations far more fragile than she'd ever imagined. And that targeting a family who'd already sacrificed everything for this country was the tactical error that would bring her entire operation crashing down. "Mr. Rivera," Karen announced, her voice carrying across the pool deck with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to discuss your continued violations of facility protocols and the impact your behavior is having on other residents' enjoyment of our community amenities." I was in the middle of helping Tommy perfect his butterfly stroke when Karen's inspection team surrounded our lane like they were conducting a drug bust. Tommy immediately swam to the pool edge, sensing the tension in the air, the way kids always do when adults are about to have an unpleasant conversation. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been doing her prescribed water walking exercises nearby, stopped mid-stride and watched with the nervous attention of someone who'd witnessed Karen's enforcement tactics before. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," I replied, keeping my voice level and respectful despite the obvious hostility radiating from her inspection team. "Tommy and I are just using the pool facilities that we pay for through our homeowner fees. Is there something specific you need to discuss?" Karen's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes, practiced and cold as winter morning. She pulled out a thick folder from her leather portfolio and began reading from what appeared to be detailed report. "According to our facility monitoring logs, you've exceeded the recommended daily usage limits on 14 separate occasions in the past month. Additionally, you've been observed providing unauthorized assistance to elderly residents, which violates our liability insurance requirements and creates potential safety hazards." Tommy discovered something interesting while organizing the meeting minutes. "Dad, look at this. Mrs. Whitfield's name appears as both the committee chairwoman and as the owner of Aquatic Solutions Consulting. Isn't that weird?" "Smart kid." I looked over his shoulder at the document he'd highlighted, and there it was, a $15,000 payment to Aquatic Solutions, consulting for professional facility assessment and optimization recommendations. A quick search through the Colorado Secretary of State's business database revealed that Aquatic Solutions Consulting was indeed owned by Karen Whitfield, registered just 3 months after she'd been elected pool committee chairwoman. The company had no employees, no physical address besides Karen's home, and no apparent qualifications for pool management beyond Karen's own self-proclaimed expertise. "Tommy, you just found evidence of something called self-dealing," I said, bookmarking the business registration page. "It's when someone in charge pays their own company with other people's money. That's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal." We spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing every vendor payment listed in the pool committee's financial records. The pattern that emerged was damning. Nearly 60% of the committee's expenditures went to companies owned either by Karen herself or by her inspection team members. Margaret Sutton's husband's auto dealership had received $8,000 for vehicle maintenance services despite the pool facility having no vehicles. Jennifer Walsh's real estate agency had been paid $12,000 for property management consulting that consisted of no documented services. The insurance liability requirements that Karen had cited to justify her rules turned out to be completely fabricated. I called our homeowner insurance company directly and spoke with an agent who confirmed that community pools had standard liability coverage that didn't restrict residents from helping each other with basic activities. There were no special requirements about unauthorized assistance, and the idea that neighbors couldn't help elderly residents with water exercises was absurd from a legal perspective. Tommy had been quietly reading through resident complaint files while I researched the insurance claims, and his next discovery was the smoking gun we needed. "Dad, these complaint letters about you are all typed on the same computer and printed on the same paper. And look at this. They're all signed by people who don't actually live here anymore." I examined the complaint letters Tommy had found in Karen's own meeting minutes. He was absolutely right. 3 formal complaints about my aggressive behavior and intimidation of residents were allegedly signed by families who'd moved out of Sunset Springs months before we'd even moved in. The signatures were obviously forged, and the complaints described incidents that were physically impossible given the timeline. Karen made up fake complaints to justify suspending us, I explained to Tommy, photographing each forged document with my phone. This is fraud, which means she's committed actual crimes to target our family. Now we need to find out why she's so determined to get rid of us. The answer came from an unexpected source, the county planning department's public records database. I'd learned to navigate government databases during my military logistics work, and something about Karen's aggressive timeline had felt familiar. When people rush to eliminate opposition, it's usually because they're facing a deadline that makes delay dangerous. What I found in the planning records explained everything. Pinnacle Development Corporation had submitted preliminary applications for a major residential project that would require rezoning the land directly adjacent to our community pool. The proposed development would add 200 luxury condominiums, which would generate enormous profits, but would also require expanded community amenities to support the increased population. The development timeline showed that Pinnacle needed to demonstrate community support and facility readiness within 90 days to maintain their development permits. But here's where it got interesting. The pool facility would need significant expansion to handle the increased usage, and current residents would be assessed a special fee to fund those improvements. Unless, of course, current usage could be reduced to make the existing facility appear adequate for the larger population. Tommy was following my explanation with the intense concentration he usually reserved for video games. So Mrs. Whitfield is trying to make people stop using the pool so the developer people can say it's big enough for more houses? And she's getting paid by them? That's exactly what's happening, buddy. Let's see if we can prove it. The proof came from cross-referencing property ownership records with the pool committee's vendor payments. Pinnacle Development Corporation was a subsidiary of Whitfield Holdings LLC, which was owned by Richard Whitfield, Karen's husband. The pool committee had been paying consulting fees to companies owned by the same family that stood to profit from the development project. Karen hadn't just been embezzling community funds and manufacturing violations. She'd been systematically driving away pool users to create artificial usage statistics that would support her husband's development project. Families like ours, who used the pool regularly and helped other residents enjoy the facility, represented obstacles to their scheme. The timeline made perfect sense now. Karen's aggressive enforcement of manufactured rules had started exactly 6 months ago, which coincided with Pinnacle's initial permit applications. Her targeting of helpful residents like me wasn't personal prejudice, it was business strategy, designed to reduce pool usage and eliminate community members who might organize resistance to the development project. Tommy had been quietly organizing financial documents while I researched the development connections, and his next observation tied everything together. Dad, look at these bank statements. The pool committee has been collecting fees from everyone, but they're not spending money on the pool. Where's all that money going? I looked at the financial records Tommy had organized, and the pattern was clear. Over $200,000 in collected homeowner fees had been diverted through the various shell companies Karen controlled, creating a slush fund that would provide startup capital for the development project. The community had been unknowingly financing their own exploitation. Tommy, I said, looking at my son who just helped expose a conspiracy that involved fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. Your mom would be so proud of you right now. You've helped uncover crimes that affect every family in our neighborhood. But the most damning evidence was still to come. Hidden in the county records was a development agreement that showed Pinnacle planned to convert the community pool into a private amenity exclusively for the new luxury condominiums, eliminating public access for current residents entirely. Karen's pool committee hadn't just been stealing money and manufacturing violations. They'd been preparing to steal the entire facility from the families who'd paid for it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made you want to spend the day outdoors, but instead of enjoying the weather, I was sitting in my kitchen at 0600 hours, drinking coffee and preparing for what the Army would have called a reconnaissance mission. Tommy was still asleep upstairs, and I had 2 hours before he needed to get ready for school. Time I planned to use gathering the final pieces of evidence that would destroy Karen Whitfield's criminal empire once and for all. My first stop was the county courthouse, where public records revealed financial connections that even I hadn't anticipated. The clerk in the property records department, a helpful woman named Patricia Chun, who recognized my military service from the veteran identification on my driver's license, helped me access incorporation documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning multiple years and involving several local businesses. "You know," Patricia said quietly while printing the documents I'd requested, "you're not the first person asking questions about these particular business entities. The state attorney general's office pulled these same files 3 weeks ago, and the IRS has flagged several of them for audit. Whatever you've stumbled onto, you're not the only one who's noticed irregularities." The incorporation papers revealed that Karen's network of shell companies extended far beyond simple pool committee fraud. Aquatic Solutions Consulting, Whitfield Holdings LLC, and Community Standards Enforcement Services were all part of a larger scheme involving property management contracts with multiple homeowners associations throughout the Denver metropolitan area. Karen and her husband had systematically infiltrated HOA boards across 6 different communities, installing themselves in positions where they could divert funds and manipulate property values for their development projects. Armed with this new information, I drove to the offices of 3 other communities where the Whitfields had implemented similar schemes. The first stop was Riverside Commons, a townhome development where residents were dealing with manufactured violations and fraudulent assessments that mirrored our situation exactly. The community manager, an exhausted-looking man named David Park, immediately understood why I was there when I mentioned Karen Whitfield's name. "She destroyed our community," David said, showing me violation notices that were nearly identical to the ones Karen had issued at Sunset Springs. Residents started moving out rather than deal with her harassment, which drove down property values and made the development vulnerable to acquisition by outside investors. 3 months after she took control, Pinnacle Development bought out half the community at below market prices. The second community, Heritage Hills, told the same story with minor variations. Karen's pool committee tactics had been adapted to target the community tennis courts and playground facilities, driving away families and elderly residents through arbitrary enforcement and manufactured safety concerns. The end result was always the same: reduced facility usage that justified limiting access, followed by development projects that eliminated community amenities entirely. At Oakwood Estates, the third community on my list, I met with former HOA President Sarah Mitchell, who'd tried to resist Karen's takeover before being forced to resign under manufactured accusations of financial mismanagement. Sarah had kept detailed records of Karen's criminal activities, and her documentation filled in gaps in my own evidence file. "The pattern is always the same," Sarah explained, showing me financial records that proved systematic embezzlement across multiple communities. "She targets communities with valuable amenities and vulnerable populations, military families, elderly residents, single parents who don't have time to fight back. She creates artificial crises that justify extreme measures, then uses those measures to eliminate resistance to her development schemes." Sarah's records included bank statements showing that Karen's various shell companies had diverted over $800,000 from community funds across 4 homeowners associations, using the money to finance development projects that eliminated the very amenities residents had paid to maintain. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and the human cost was even worse. Hundreds of families had been driven from their homes through harassment and manufactured violations. But here's the thing, Sarah continued, pulling out a thick folder of correspondence with state and federal agencies. Karen's been too successful for her own good. The Attorney General's office has been investigating HOA fraud statewide, and they've connected her activities to a larger pattern of organized crime involving property developers and corrupt management companies. Your situation at Sunset Springs might be the final piece they need to file criminal charges. I returned home with evidence that transformed our pool committee dispute into something much larger and more serious. Tommy was waiting for me at the kitchen table with his own discoveries, having used my laptop to research news, articles about development fraud and HOA corruption while I'd been gathering documents from other communities. "Dad, look at this," Tommy said, showing me a newspaper article from the Denver Post about federal investigations into property development schemes. Mrs. Whitfield's husband is mentioned by name as someone the FBI is investigating for using fake companies to steal money from homeowners associations. The article confirmed what I'd suspected. Our situation was part of a federal criminal investigation that had been building for months. The FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force had been tracking the Whitfield's activities across multiple jurisdictions, gathering evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges that could result in decades of prison time. Tommy had also found something that explained Koreans' increasingly desperate behavior over the past week. According to court records he'd accessed through the state judicial database, Pinnacle Development Corporation was facing bankruptcy proceedings if they couldn't secure the zoning approvals needed for the Sunset Springs expansion project. 90-day deadline I'd identified wasn't just a bureaucratic requirement. It was the difference between millions in profits and financial ruin for the entire Whitfield criminal enterprise. "She's not just being mean to our family," Tommy observed with a logical clarity that made me proud every day. "She's scared that her stealing plan is going to get discovered, so she's trying to scare everyone away before people figure out what she's really doing." That afternoon, I received a phone call that confirmed Tommy's analysis and revealed just how desperate Karen had become. The caller was Detective Angela Rodriguez from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who'd been monitoring our situation as part of their broader investigation into HOA fraud schemes. "Mr. Rivera," Detective Rodriguez said, "we understand you've been gathering evidence about financial irregularities in your homeowners association. We'd like to meet with you and discuss what you've discovered, because your documentation might be crucial to prosecuting a case we've been building for 18 months. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning at the CBI field office in Denver, but Detective Rodriguez warned me that Karen's behavior was likely to escalate dramatically as the investigation became public knowledge. People involved in organized fraud schemes often become dangerous when they realize they're about to be exposed," she explained. "Document everything, avoid confrontations, and call us immediately if she or her associates make any threats against your family." That evening, as Tommy and I organized our evidence for the meeting with Detective Rodriguez, we received one final piece of proof that Karen's criminal enterprise was collapsing around her. Mr. Rodriguez called to report that Karen had shown up at his house with 2 men he didn't recognize, demanding that he sign a document disclaiming any interest in pool facilities and agreeing not to pursue legal action against the pool committee. "She was desperate, Marcus," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice shaking with anger. "When I refused to sign her paper, one of the men with her suggested that elderly veterans who didn't cooperate with community standards might find themselves dealing with safety inspections that could affect their housing situation. They were threatening my home because I wouldn't help them cover up their crimes. The threat against Mr. Rodriguez crossed a line that transformed our civil dispute into something that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Karen Whitfield had just escalated from fraud and harassment to criminal intimidation of elderly veterans, and she'd done it with witnesses who could testify about organized crime tactics designed to silence opposition to her development scheme. Tommy looked up from the evidence binder he'd been organizing and asked the question that would guide our final strategy. "Dad, when are we going to stop her from hurting people?" The answer was simple. Tomorrow morning, when we walked into the CBI field office with evidence that would end Karen's criminal career and return the community pool to the families who'd paid for it. Friday morning arrived with the weight of finality that comes before decisive battles. Tommy and I were dressed and ready by 0630 hours. Our evidence binder organized with military precision and a backup drive containing every document, photograph, and recording we'd gathered over the past week. As we loaded into my truck for the drive to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation field office, neither of us realized that Karen Whitfield was about to make the most catastrophic mistake of her criminal career. The CBI building in downtown Denver looked like every other government facility I'd visited during my military service, functional, secure, and designed to intimidate people who weren't accustomed to dealing with law enforcement. Detective Angela Rodriguez met us in the lobby, a professional woman in her early 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years building cases against white-collar criminals. "Mr. Rivera," Detective Rodriguez said, shaking my hand with the firm grip that military people recognize in each other. "And you must be Tommy. I understand you've been helping your dad with research. That's impressive work for someone your age." Tommy beamed with pride as we followed Detective Rodriguez through security checkpoints and into a conference room, where 2 other investigators were waiting. Special Agent Michael Chun from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster, while Colorado Attorney General Investigator Sarah Williams had the sharp-eyed appearance of someone who specialized in unraveling complex fraud schemes. "Before we begin," Detective Rodriguez said, setting up a digital recorder, "I want you to understand that what you've uncovered is part of a much larger investigation. The Whitfields have been operating this scheme across multiple communities for over 4 years, and we estimate they've defrauded homeowners associations of more than $2 million. Special Agent Chun opened a thick file folder and spread photographs across the conference table. "These are surveillance photos from our investigation into Pinnacle Development Corporation and their network of shell companies. We've been building a RICO case that includes mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges against 15 individuals involved in this criminal enterprise." The photograph showed Karen meeting with known associates of organized crime figures who specialized in property development fraud. Her husband Richard appeared in several images, along with local officials who'd been accepting bribes to expedite zoning approvals and permit applications. The scope of the conspiracy was far beyond anything I'd imagined when this started as a simple pool committee dispute. "Your documentation has been crucial," Sarah Williams explained, reviewing the evidence binder Tommy and I had prepared, particularly the financial records showing how they manipulate community budgets and the timeline connecting their enforcement actions to development deadlines. "But we need something more to make the charges stick in federal court." "What kind of something?" Tommy asked, surprising the investigators with his direct question. Detective Rodriguez smiled and answered him seriously, treating his 8-year-old curiosity with the respect it deserved. "We need evidence of the conspiracy in action," she explained. "Recordings of them planning crimes, documents showing they know their activities are illegal, or witnesses who can testify about being threatened or intimidated." Your dad's situation gives us an opportunity to gather that evidence if we can get them to reveal their real intentions. Special Agent Chun leaned forward with the intensity of someone presenting a critical mission briefing. Mr. Rivera, we'd like to ask you to wear a recording device during any future interactions with Karen Whitfield or her associates. Based on their pattern of behavior, we expect them to escalate their threats as they realize their scheme is being exposed. If we can record them making explicit threats or admitting to criminal activities, we'll have everything we need to arrest the entire organization. The request felt familiar from my military experience with intelligence gathering operations. But this time my son would be involved in a situation that could become dangerous if Karen's desperation led to violence. I looked at Tommy, who was listening to this conversation with the serious attention he gave to important adult discussions. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, "if we help catch the bad guys, will other families be safe from people like Mrs. Whitfield?" The question reminded me why we'd started this fight in the first place, not just to protect our own family, but to prevent other vulnerable families from becoming victims of predatory schemes. "Yes, buddy," I replied. "If we help stop them, kids like you and elderly people like Mr. Rodriguez will be safe from bullies who abuse their power." I turned to the investigators and nodded my acceptance of their request. "What do you need me to do?" The technical briefing took 30 minutes, covering the recording equipment I'd wear and the legal requirements for gathering evidence that could be used in federal court. The device was smaller than I'd expected, virtually undetectable. When properly positioned and designed to capture clear audio even in noisy environments like community meetings or pool facilities. "The key is to let them talk," Detective Rodriguez explained. "Don't ask leading questions or try to trap them into admissions. Just document whatever they say naturally, and if they make threats or reveal criminal intentions, we'll have everything we need for arrests and indictments." As we prepared to leave the CBI office, Special Agent Chun's phone rang with news that changed everything. "They're moving faster than we expected," he said after ending the call. "Karen Whitfield has called an emergency community meeting for this afternoon, claiming there's a security threat that requires immediate action. Our sources suggest she's planning to announce permanent closure of the pool facility due to safety concerns." The timeline made perfect sense from a criminal perspective. Karen knew that federal investigators were closing in, and she needed to eliminate the pool facility before anyone could prove that her committee had been operating without legal authority. By claiming safety concerns and emergency closure, she could destroy evidence and complete the transfer of community assets to her development company before law enforcement could intervene. "She's accelerating the endgame," Sarah Williams observed, gathering her files with the urgency of someone whose investigation had just become time-critical. If she succeeds in closing the pool and transferring the property to Pinnacle Development, it will be much harder to recover the stolen funds or restore community access to the facility. Tommy had been following this conversation with growing excitement, recognizing that we were about to witness the conclusion of the mystery we'd been solving together. "Dad, are we going to stop her at the meeting today?" he asked his 8-year-old sense of justice clearly anticipating a satisfying resolution. "We're going to let her stop herself," I replied, checking the recording device Special Agent Chun had given me. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to give them enough rope to hang themselves with their own words. The emergency community meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Sunset Springs Community Center, giving us just enough time to return home and prepare for what would either be Karen's final victory or the moment when her entire criminal enterprise collapsed under the weight of her own desperation. As we drove back toward our neighborhood, I realized that the disabled veteran Karen had tried to intimidate was about to become the key witness in a federal investigation that would send her to prison and return millions of dollars in stolen funds to the family she'd victimized. The war was about to end. And Karen Whitfield had no idea that she'd just declared defeat on herself. The Sunset Springs Community Center buzzed with nervous energy as 89 of the 127 homeowners filled folding chairs that squeaked against the polished floor. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across a room that felt more like a courtroom than a community meeting space. Tommy sat beside me in the third row, his notebook open and ready to document what we both knew would be Korean. Whitfield's final performance as pool committee dictator. Karen arrived precisely at 2 p.m. with an entourage that looked like a corporate board meeting crossed with a police raid. Her usual inspection team was supplemented by 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the predatory confidence of people accustomed to intimidating others for money. Behind them walked a woman with a briefcase and the cold expression of someone whose job involved making problems disappear permanently. The community center's atmosphere was thick with tension and confusion. Residents whispered among themselves about the emergency nature of the meeting and the serious tone of Karen's notification letter, which had warned about immediate safety concerns and necessary facility modifications that would affect everyone's property values. Mrs. Patterson sat near the front, her hands folded nervously in her lap, while Mr. Rodriguez occupied a seat by the wall where he could observe everything happening without missing important details. Karen took her position behind the podium like a general addressing troops before a final battle. She wore a navy business suit that probably cost more than most residents spent on monthly groceries, and her confident smile suggested someone who believed victory was assured. The recording device hidden beneath my shirt captured every word as she began what would become a comprehensive confession to multiple federal crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I've called this emergency meeting to address serious safety and liability issues that threaten our community's financial stability and residents' well-being. Recent incidents involving unauthorized activities and aggressive behavior by certain residents have created legal exposure that requires immediate action." She gestured toward one of the suited men, introducing him as Bradford Pierce from Pierce & Associates Legal Services, though a quick internet search that morning had revealed that Pierce's law license had been suspended for client fraud and that his firm was under investigation for money laundering. The second man was identified as Dr. Marcus Webb, supposedly a safety consultant, though Tommy's research had discovered that Webb's doctorate was in marketing rather than safety engineering. "Dr. Webb has conducted a comprehensive safety assessment of our pool facility," Karen continued, pulling out a thick report that looked professionally bound, but contained conclusions that contradicted basic physics and established safety standards. "His findings indicate that the pool poses significant liability risks that make continued operation financially impossible for our community." Dr. Webb stepped forward with the polished presentation skills of someone who'd spent years selling snake oil to unsuspecting victims. His supposed safety assessment claimed that the pool's design encouraged high-risk activities and attracted unsuitable user populations that created insurance liability beyond acceptable community standards. The language was carefully crafted to sound technical while actually meaning nothing, but the intended message was clear. Families like mine were too dangerous to be allowed near the facility. Furthermore, Webb continued, pointing to charts and graphs that looked impressive but contained fabricated data, recent usage patterns indicate that certain residents are treating the facility as a private rehabilitation center rather than a shared community resource. This creates legal exposure under the Americans with Disabilities Act and requires extensive modifications that would cost the community over $300 in compliance upgrades. The lies were so outrageous that several residents immediately began questioning the conclusions. Linda Morrison stood up from her seat near the back and asked about the specific safety incidents that justified such drastic action. My daughter and her friends have never had any problems at the pool, she said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd been dealing with Karen's harassment for weeks. What exactly are these high-risk activities you're talking about? Karen's response revealed the depth of her desperation and the criminal nature of her scheme. Mrs. Morrison, the pool committee has documented multiple incidents involving aggressive residents who refuse to comply with safety protocols and threaten other community members when asked to follow established guidelines. These incidents have created a hostile environment that our insurance company considers unacceptable. Show us the documentation, called out Jim Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son who'd driven down from Boulder specifically to support his mother through what he suspected was harassment of elderly residents. If there are multiple safety incidents, there should be incident reports, insurance claims, and police reports. Where are those documents? The question hit its target with surgical precision. Corinne's confident expression flickered for just a moment as she realized she'd been challenged to produce evidence that didn't exist. Bradford Pierce stepped forward to rescue her with legal-sounding nonsense about confidentiality requirements and litigation concerns. But the damage was already done. Residents were beginning to understand that Karen's emergency meeting was based on manufactured crisis rather than actual safety concerns. That's when Karen made the mistake that would send her to federal prison. Faced with growing skepticism from residents who were asking uncomfortable questions, she decided to reveal the real reason for the pool closure. The truth is, she said, her voice taking on the edge of someone whose patience had been exhausted, this community needs to evolve beyond its current limitations. We have an opportunity to partner with Pinnacle Development Corporation on a project that will significantly increase property values for every homeowner here. The admission sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the room. Several residents immediately understood the implications of Karen's words, and Tommy quietly wrote, "She just confessed," in his notebook while the recording device captured every incriminating statement. Pinnacle has offered to purchase the pool facility and surrounding common areas for $2.3 million. Karen continued, apparently believing that the promise of money would overcome residents' concerns about losing their community amenities. This represents a windfall profit that could eliminate homeowner fees for the next 15 years while providing access to upgraded facilities in the new development complex. Mr. Rodriguez stood up slowly, his 71-year-old frame carrying the dignity of someone who'd served his country honorably and recognized betrayal when he saw it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying across the room with military authority, "are you saying that you've been planning to sell our pool without homeowner approval? Because that sounds like theft of community property." Karen's mask finally slipped completely as she realized that her carefully planned presentation had become a public confession to criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Rodriguez, the pool committee has fiduciary authority to make decisions that protect community interests. Sometimes that requires difficult choices that individual residents might not initially understand. The pool committee has no authority to sell community property," I said, standing up and activating the voice recorder on my phone for backup documentation. "I've researched the legal requirements, and any sale of common area facilities requires a vote by 2/3 of all homeowners. You can't unilaterally decide to sell amenities that we've all paid to maintain." Bradford Pierce immediately tried to intimidate me with threats about disrupting official proceedings and violating meeting protocols, but his aggressive tone only reinforced residents' growing understanding that Karen's team was operating outside legal boundaries. The recording device captured every threat and every admission as Karen's criminal conspiracy unraveled in real time. The final nail in Karen's coffin came when Tommy asked the question that exposed the entire scheme with 8-year-old logic. That cut through all the legal obfuscation and corporate doublespeak. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his clear voice carrying across the silent room, "if you sell our pool to make money for yourself, where are kids supposed to learn how to swim?" The silence that followed Tommy's question was devastating. Karen stared at my son with the expression of someone who just realized that her entire criminal enterprise had been destroyed by a child who understood fairness better than adults, who'd spent years rationalizing theft and fraud. The community center erupted in angry voices as residents finally understood the scope of Karen's betrayal. Mrs. Patterson stood up with the righteous fury of someone who'd been targeted for helping others, her voice carrying across the room as she addressed Karen directly. "You've been harassing my family and my neighbors while planning to steal our pool for your own profit. How long have you been lying to us about safety concerns when you just wanted to eliminate anyone who might oppose your criminal scheme?" Karen's composure cracked completely as she realized that her confession had turned the entire community against her. The two suited men flanking her began backing toward the exit, clearly recognizing that their association with her criminal enterprise was about to become a liability rather than an asset. Bradford Pierce fumbled with his briefcase while Dr. Webb's face went pale as residents began demanding to see his fabricated safety reports. "This meeting is over," Karen announced, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "The pool committee has made its decision, and residents who continue to disrupt community proceedings will face legal consequences for interfering with official business." That's when Tommy delivered the observation that would become legendary in Sunset Springs history. Standing up on his chair so everyone could see him, my 8-year-old son looked directly at Karen and said with perfect clarity, "My dad taught me that people who steal from kids and old people are called criminals, not community leaders." The room fell silent as Tommy's words hung in the air like a moral judgment that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Even Karen's supporters looked uncomfortable as they realized they'd been enabling someone who'd systematically victimized vulnerable families for personal profit. The recording device captured the moment when Karen Whitfield's reign of terror officially ended, destroyed by the simple honesty of a child who understood right from wrong. Jim Patterson pulled out his cell phone and announced that he was calling the police to report suspected embezzlement and fraud. Linda Morrison began organizing residents to demand an immediate audit of all pool committee financial records. Mr. Rodriguez walked to the front of the room and addressed the community with the authority of someone who'd served his country honorably and wouldn't tolerate corruption in civilian life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the command presence that comes from military leadership experience, "we've just heard Mrs. Whitfield confess to planning the sale of community property without homeowner approval. That's not poor judgment or difficult decision-making. That's theft, plain and simple." The crowd's anger focused like a laser beam as residents began sharing their own experiences with Karen's harassment and manufactured violations. Families who'd thought they were alone in being targeted realized they were part of a systematic pattern of intimidation designed to eliminate opposition to criminal conspiracy. The isolation that had made Karen's scheme possible evaporated as neighbors finally connected their individual experiences into a comprehensive picture of organized fraud. Karen made one final desperate attempt to maintain control by threatening legal action against residents who interfered with pool committee operations. "Anyone who continues to disrupt this meeting or spread defamatory accusations will be subject to community fines and legal action for violating homeowner association bylaws," she announced, waving a thick folder of official-looking documents. "Show us those bylaws," demanded Sarah Mitchell, a retired paralegal who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. "Because I've read our community charter, and there's no provision for pool committee authority to fine residents or take legal action. Where exactly do you get the authority to threaten homeowners for asking questions about their own property?" The challenge hit Karen's weakest point, Her entire power structure was built on manufactured authority that had no legal foundation. When residents began demanding to see the specific bylaws that justified her committee's actions, she couldn't produce them because they didn't exist. The pool committee had been operating as a criminal enterprise disguised as community management, and Karen's inability to cite legitimate authority exposed the fraud for everyone to see. That's when Detective Angela Rodriguez and Special Agent Michael Chun entered the community center with the calm professionalism of law enforcement officers who'd been listening to everything through the recording device I'd been wearing. The sight of federal investigators immediately changed the atmosphere from angry community meeting to criminal crime scene as residents realized their suspicions about Karen's activities had been justified. Mrs. Whitfield, Detective Rodriguez, announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone with actual legal power rather than manufactured bureaucratic control. We need to speak with you about irregularities in your pool committee financial records and your involvement with Pinnacle Development Corporation. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to an attorney. Karen's face went from red with anger to white with terror as she realized that her criminal activities had attracted federal attention. Bradford Pierce abandoned any pretense of representing her interests and headed for the exit, leaving Karen to face the consequences of her fraud scheme alone. Dr. Webb's fabricated safety reports suddenly became evidence of conspiracy rather than professional consultation. The arrest process unfolded with methodical precision as Special Agent Chun read Karen her Miranda rights while Detective Rodriguez secured the fraudulent documents she'd been using to justify the pool closure. Residents watched in stunned silence as the woman, who'd terrorized their community for months, was handcuffed and escorted from the building like the common criminal she'd always been. Tommy watched Karen's arrest with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped solve a mystery that protected people he cared about. "Dad," he whispered as the federal agents led Karen away, "does this mean Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Patterson can use the pool again without being scared of the mean lady?" "Yes, buddy," I replied, looking around at neighbors who were talking to each other honestly for the first time in months. "It means everyone can use the facilities they've paid for without being harassed by people who abuse their power." The community meeting transformed into an impromptu celebration as residents began organizing to restore democratic management of their common areas. Sarah Mitchell volunteered to serve as interim pool committee chairwoman until proper elections could be held. Jim Patterson offered to coordinate with federal investigators to recover the stolen funds and ensure proper financial oversight. Linda Morrison suggested establishing the Community Watch program to prevent future exploitation by outside criminals. 3 weeks later, the federal grand jury returned indictments against Karen Whitfield, her husband Richard, and 14 associates involved in their property development fraud scheme. The charges included racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering across multiple jurisdictions. Karen's criminal enterprise had stolen over $2.3 million from homeowners associations, and she faced up to 40 years in federal prison. The civil recovery lawsuit returned $847,000 in stolen funds to Sunset Springs residents, money that was used to upgrade pool facilities and eliminate homeowner fees for 2 years. Karen's house was seized as part of the criminal asset forfeiture, and Pinnacle Development Corporation was dissolved after bankruptcy proceedings that revealed extensive organized crime connections. But the most important transformation was personal. Tommy had learned that standing up to bullies required courage, evidence, and persistence rather than anger or violence. He'd seen that children could make a difference when adults were too scared or tired to fight back. And he'd watched his father honor his mother's memory by protecting families who needed help from someone with the skills and determination to fight systematic corruption. The pool reopened under community management with new policies that emphasized inclusion, family activities, and support for elderly residents who needed assistance with therapeutic exercises. Tommy's swimming lessons resumed with friends whose families had been targeted by Karen's harassment campaign. Mrs. Patterson returned to her water, walking routine with confidence that her prescribed exercises wouldn't result in manufactured violations. On warm evenings when Tommy and I sat by the pool watching sunset paint the water gold, we'd remember the woman who'd tried to steal our community's heart for personal profit, and the neighbors who'd stood together to protect what belonged to everyone. Sometimes the smallest voices can expose the biggest corruption, and sometimes protecting one family means saving an entire community from predators who mistake vulnerability for weakness. 6 months after Karen Whitfield's arrest, I was sitting in my kitchen reviewing an unexpected business proposal when Tommy burst through the front door with the excitement that only comes from 8-year-olds who've discovered something amazing. He'd been at the pool with his friend Jake Rodriguez, and according to his breathless explanation, something incredible had happened that would change everything about our community's future. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," Tommy said, dropping his swim bag and grabbing a glass of water while still dripping from his afternoon at the pool. "Mrs. Patterson told me that the county is putting the old Whitfield house up for auction because of the criminal stuff, and she thinks we should buy it because it has the best view of the pool and we could turn it into something that helps families like ours." The idea was so unexpected that I actually laughed out loud. The notion of owning Karen's former mansion, the symbol of her fraudulent empire, felt like poetic justice on a scale I'd never imagined possible. But as Tommy continued explaining Mrs. Patterson's suggestion, I realized there might be genuine merit to what sounded like a child's fantasy about defeating the neighborhood villain by literally taking over her castle. The Whitfield property had been seized by federal marshals as part of the criminal asset forfeiture proceedings, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was indeed preparing to auction it to recover funds for victims of the fraud scheme. The house itself was a 4,200-square-foot monument to Karen's stolen wealth, complete with a 3-car garage, swimming pool, and panoramic views of the community facilities she'd tried to steal from the families who'd paid for them. More intriguingly, the property included a separate building that Karen had used as her pool committee headquarters, complete with office space, meeting rooms, and storage facilities that could easily be converted for legitimate community purposes. The irony of transforming Karen's criminal command center into a facility that actually served residents' needs was almost too perfect to resist. That evening, I called Detective Rodriguez to inquire about the auction timeline and legal requirements for purchasing seized criminal assets. The conversation revealed details about the forfeiture process that made Tommy's suggestion seem less like childhood fantasy and more like a legitimate opportunity to create something positive from the wreckage of Karen's criminal enterprise. "The auction is scheduled for next month," Detective Rodriguez explained. "The property has been appraised at $890,000, but given the criminal history and the community's negative associations with the location, the U.S. Attorney expects it to sell for significantly less than market value. Veterans get preference in federal asset auctions, and your role in exposing the fraud scheme would definitely work in your favor." The financial analysis was complex but encouraging. My VA disability benefits, combined with the settlement from Karen's civil lawsuit and my savings from military service, would cover a substantial down payment. The monthly mortgage payments would actually be lower than our current rent, since the seized property was being sold at auction prices rather than market rates. More importantly, the separate office building could generate rental income from community organizations that needed meeting space and administrative facilities. Tommy had been listening to my conversation with Detective Rodriguez with the intense concentration he usually reserved for complex math problems. When I hung up, he immediately began outlining what he called our plan to make the mean lady's house into something good for families. "Dad, think about it," Tommy said. using the logical reasoning skills his mother had taught him for school. Projects. Mrs. Whitfield used that house to hurt people and steal money from families. But we could use it to help people instead. The big office building could be where families go when they need help with bullies like her. His suggestion sparked an idea that grew more compelling the more I considered it. The office building could indeed be converted into a community resource center focused on helping families navigate HOA disputes, property management conflicts, and the kind of bureaucratic harassment that Karen had specialized in. My background in military logistics and legal research, combined with Tommy's organizational skills and natural sense of justice, could create something genuinely valuable for vulnerable families. Over the following weeks, Tommy and I developed what we called Project Homebase, a comprehensive plan for transforming Karen's former criminal headquarters into a community advocacy center. The main house would serve as our family residence, while the office building would provide free consultation services for families dealing with HOA corruption, property management fraud, and bureaucratic intimidation. The concept attracted immediate support from neighbors who'd experienced Karen's harassment firsthand. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to help with administrative tasks, drawing on her decades of experience managing her late husband's medical practice. Mr. Rodriguez offered to share his knowledge about veterans' rights and disability advocacy with families who needed help navigating complex bureaucratic systems. Linda Morrison, whose background in social work made her an expert on family crisis intervention, agreed to help develop programs for single parents dealing with housing discrimination. Sarah Mitchell, the retired paralegal who'd helped expose Karen's fraudulent bylaws, became our unofficial legal advisor and helped research the regulatory requirements for establishing a nonprofit advocacy organization. Her investigation revealed that Colorado had recently passed legislation providing tax incentives for community-based organizations that helped families resist predatory property management schemes. The auction day arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn morning that reminded me of mission briefings in Afghanistan, moments when careful preparation would determine whether complex operations succeeded or failed catastrophically. Tommy insisted on attending the auction, wearing his best shirt and carrying a notebook where he'd calculated exactly how much money we could afford to spend without compromising our family's financial security. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with real estate investors, curiosity seekers, and neighbors who'd come to witness the final chapter of Karen Whitfield's criminal career. The auctioneer, a professional who'd handled hundreds of similar sales, explained the bidding process and legal requirements while federal marshals supervised the proceedings with the methodical attention that government operations require. Bidding started at $600,000, reflecting the property's criminal history and the community's negative associations with its former owner. Several investors made half-hearted offers, but their enthusiasm was clearly dampened by the location's notoriety and the potential complications of owning property in a neighborhood where the previous owner had been universally hated. When the bidding stalled at $720,000, I raised my hand and offered $750,000, a price that represented our maximum budget, but would give us ownership of both the main house and the office building that could become the foundation for our advocacy center. The silence that followed my bid was broken only by Tommy's whispered, "Come on, Dad, we can do this," and the auctioneer's call for competing offers. 3 more bidders emerged, including a property developer who clearly hadn't researched the locations, history, and a real estate investor who thought the criminal associations would fade with time. The bidding escalated slowly, with each increase representing thousands of dollars that would determine whether our plan for community advocacy would become reality or remain an 8-year-old's idealistic dream. At $810,000, the property developer dropped out after his assistant whispered something about neighborhood associations and legal complications. The real estate investor continued bidding mechanically until $840,000, When he apparently reached his predetermined limit and shook his head at the auctioneer's request for higher offers. Going once at $840,000, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps where neighbors held their breath, and Tommy gripped my hand with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview was about to be validated or shattered. Going twice at $840,000. The pause felt eternal, filled with the weight of possibilities that would determine whether Karen's former headquarters would become a tool for helping families or just another real estate transaction that benefited investors rather than the community that had suffered under her criminal regime. Sold to bidder number 17 for $840,000. Tommy's victory cheer echoed off the courthouse walls as neighbors applauded and federal marshals began the paperwork that would transfer ownership of Karen, Whitfield's former empire, to the disabled veteran and his 8-year-old son who'd exposed her crimes and protected their community from systematic fraud. 6 weeks later, we moved into our new home with the help of every neighbor who'd been victimized by Karen's harassment campaign. The main house became our family residence, while the office building was transformed into the Sunset Springs Community Advocacy Center, complete with meeting rooms for families dealing with HOA disputes, a resource library about tenant rights, and property management law and consultation services for vulnerable residents who needed help fighting bureaucratic intimidation. The Advocacy Center's first client was an elderly widow from a neighboring community whose HOA had been threatening foreclosure over manufactured violations that mirrored Karen's tactics exactly. Tommy sat in on the consultation meeting, taking notes and asking questions that helped identify the same patterns of financial fraud and procedural abuse that had characterized Karen's criminal enterprise. Within 6 months, our advocacy center had helped expose corruption in 4 other homeowners associations, recovered over $200,000 in fraudulent fees and assessments, and provided free legal consultation to 47 families who'd been targeted by predatory property management companies. The irony of using Karen's former criminal headquarters to fight the same type of corruption she'd specialized in was lost on no one, especially the federal prosecutors who'd used our center as a model for community-based fraud prevention programs. The most satisfying transformation was personal. Every morning, Tommy and I would have breakfast in the kitchen that had once belonged to the woman who'd tried to destroy our family for the crime of helping elderly neighbors with therapeutic exercises. Every evening, we'd sit on the deck overlooking the community pool where children played safely and elderly residents exercised without fear of harassment or manufactured violations. The community pool itself had been upgraded using the recovered funds from Karen's criminal enterprise with new accessibility features, expanded therapeutic facilities, and family-friendly policies that encouraged inclusion rather than exclusion. Tommy's swimming lessons resumed in the same lanes where Karen had once photographed him to create evidence for her fraudulent violation reports. Karen Whitfield herself was serving a 12-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison in Colorado, where she'd become just another inmate rather than the suburban dictator who'd terrorized families for personal profit. Her husband Richard had received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, and their entire criminal network had been dismantled by federal prosecutors who'd used our documentation as the foundation for their RICO case. The pool that Karen had tried to steal now belongs to the community forever, protected by legal safeguards that prevent future exploitation by corrupt management companies. And the house she'd bought with stolen money now serves families who need help fighting the same type of predatory scheme she'd specialized in. Every day, when Tommy and I walk past the community pool on our way to the advocacy center, we remember the lesson that changed everything. Sometimes protecting one family means saving an entire community, and sometimes the smallest voices can expose the biggest corruption. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or law enforcement. Sometimes it comes from 8-year-olds who understand fairness better than adults who've forgotten the difference between authority and bullying. 2 years after purchasing Karen's former mansion and transforming it into the Sunset Springs Community Advocacy Center, I received a phone call that would test everything Tommy and I had learned about fighting corruption and protecting vulnerable families. The caller was Rebecca Martinez, a single mother from Riverside Meadows, a community 30 miles north of Denver where a familiar pattern of harassment and manufactured violations was targeting military families and elderly residents, Mr. Rivera. Rebecca said, her voice shaking with the exhaustion that comes from fighting bureaucratic intimidation while trying to raise children alone. I got your number from Detective Rodriguez. She said you might be able to help families like mine deal with HOA corruption. My son Jake is autistic, and the new management company is trying to force us out because they claim his therapy equipment in our backyard violates community standards. The details Rebecca shared were depressingly familiar. Arbitrary rule changes targeting specific families, manufactured safety concerns about children's medical equipment, and escalating fines designed to force residents into financial distress. The management company, Heritage Property Solutions, had taken control of Riverside Meadows 6 months earlier and immediately begun implementing policies that seemed designed to eliminate families with special needs. Children. Tommy, now 10 years old and my unofficial partner in community advocacy work, listened to Rebecca's story with the serious attention he'd developed for cases involving children who were being bullied by adults who abused their authority. "Dad," he said after I'd finished the call, "this sounds exactly like what Mrs. Whitfield was doing to us, but they're targeting kids who need extra help. That's even worse than stealing money." The observation was typically insightful for Tommy, who developed an acute sense of justice through our advocacy work with vulnerable families. Over the past 2 years, he'd sat in on dozens of consultation meetings, helped organize evidence files, and learned to recognize the patterns that characterized predatory property management schemes. His ability to see through adult deceptions and identify the core issues had become legendary among the families we'd helped. Our investigation into Heritage Property Solutions began the same way all our cases did, with systematic research into corporate structures, financial relationships, and the backgrounds of key personnel involved in targeting vulnerable families. Tommy had become expert at navigating public records databases, while I used my military intelligence training to identify connections between seemingly separate entities. The research revealed disturbing parallels to Karen Whitfield's criminal enterprise. Heritage Property Solutions was owned by Consolidated Management, LLC, which was controlled by a network of shell companies that traced back to Summit Development Corporation. The pattern of interlocking businesses designed to obscure ownership and financial relationships was identical to the structure Karen had used to embezzle funds from multiple homeowners associations. More troubling was the discovery that Heritage's systematic targeting of military families and disabled residents followed the same playbook Karen had used: identify vulnerable populations who might lack resources to fight back, manufacture violations that justified escalating harassment, and create artificial crises that justified transferring community assets to development companies, controlled by the same people running the management scheme. Tommy's research uncovered financial connections that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Summit Development Corporation had recently acquired development rights to 200 acres adjacent to Riverside Meadows, contingent on demonstrating that existing community facilities were adequate for expanded population density. By driving away families who used community amenities heavily, Heritage could create usage statistics that supported development permits for projects that would eliminate those amenities entirely. "Dad, look at this," Tommy said, showing me a timeline he'd created connecting Heritage's management contract with Summit's development applications. They started targeting military families and kids with disabilities exactly 2 weeks after Summit filed their permit applications. This isn't random harassment, it's business strategy designed to steal people's homes and community facilities. The pattern extended beyond Riverside Meadows to 3 other communities where Heritage had implemented similar schemes. Military. Families were receiving violations for displaying American flags. Disabled residents were being cited for mobility equipment that supposedly violated aesthetic standards. And elderly homeowners were facing manufactured safety assessments that threatened their housing security. Each targeted family represented opposition to development projects that would eliminate community amenities while generating millions in profits for Summit's investors. Our intervention strategy borrowed from military operational planning. Gather comprehensive intelligence, identify enemy weaknesses, build coalition support, and execute coordinated action that would expose the entire criminal enterprise, while protecting individual families from retaliation. Tommy suggested that we start by helping Rebecca document Heritage's violations to establish a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. The documentation process revealed the sophisticated nature of Heritage's harassment campaign. Rebecca's son Jake, an 8-year-old boy with autism, used a sensory swing in their backyard as part of his prescribed therapy routine. Heritage had cited this medically necessary equipment as an unauthorized recreational structure that violated community aesthetic standards. Despite similar playground equipment being visible in dozens of other yards throughout the neighborhood, the selective enforcement was surgical in its precision. Heritage ignored obvious violations by families who didn't represent obstacles to Summit's development plans while manufacturing complex regulatory justifications for targeting families whose children had special needs, whose parents served in the military, or whose elderly members required accessibility accommodations that might complicate future construction projects. Tommy accompanied me to our first meeting with Rebecca Martinez and her son Jake, bringing his own perspective as a child who'd experienced adult harassment for reasons that made no sense from a kid's perspective. The connection between the boys was immediate and powerful. Jake understood that Tommy had fought similar battles and won, while Tommy recognized in Jake the same confusion and fear he'd felt when Karen Whitfield had targeted our family. "Jake," Tommy said during our consultation meeting, speaking directly to Rebecca's son with the matter-of-fact honesty that children use with each other, "the adults who are being mean to your family are breaking the law to steal money, just like the mean lady who tried to hurt my dad and me. We know how to catch them and make them stop hurting people." The simple explanation accomplished what hours of legal discussion couldn't. Jake understood that his family situation wasn't their fault, that the adults targeting them were criminals rather than legitimate authorities, and that other families had successfully fought similar battles. For the first time in months, Rebecca saw her son smile with genuine hope rather than the forced cheerfulness he'd been maintaining to avoid worrying his mother. Our investigation into Heritage Property Solutions accelerated when Detective Rodriguez agreed to review our preliminary findings and compare them to patterns identified in other property management fraud cases. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had been tracking complaints about Heritage for 6 months, but individual families' reports hadn't revealed the systematic nature of their targeting strategy. "Mr. Rivera," Detective Rodriguez said during our briefing meeting at the Advocacy Center, "what you and Tommy have documented suggests that Heritage is operating the same type of criminal enterprise that Karen Whitfield ran, but on a larger scale and with more sophisticated legal cover. If we can prove discriminatory targeting of protected classes, we'll have federal civil rights violations in addition to the financial crimes." The civil rights angle was crucial because it provided additional legal protections for families like Rebecca's, whose children's disabilities made them particularly vulnerable to harassment disguised as community standards enforcement. Federal disability rights laws prohibited discrimination against families based on their children's medical needs, and Heritage's targeting of therapeutic equipment constituted clear violations that could trigger FBI investigation. Tommy's next discovery elevated our case from local community advocacy to federal criminal investigation. While researching Heritage's corporate structure, he'd found email addresses that connected their executives to the same organized crime. Figures who'd been involved in Karen Whitfield's conspiracy. Summit Development Corporation shared investors with Pinnacle Development, and several key personnel had moved from Karen's network to Heritage's operation after the original conspiracy had been exposed. "Dad, they're not just copying Mrs. Whitfield's plan," Tommy explained, showing me organizational charts he'd created to track personnel connections between the criminal enterprises. "They're the same bad guys who worked with her, and they're doing the same crimes to different families because they think nobody will figure it out twice." The realization that we were dealing with an expanded version of Karen's original criminal network rather than copycat criminals changed everything about our approach. These weren't local bullies who'd gotten carried away with minor authority. They were experienced criminals who'd learned from Karen's mistakes and developed more sophisticated methods for stealing community assets while eliminating opposition. Federal investigation that followed moved with the efficiency that comes from prosecutors who'd already built successful cases against the same criminal network. Special Agent Chun, who'd led the original investigation into Karen's conspiracy, recognized the patterns immediately and authorized surveillance operations that documented Heritage's criminal activities across multiple communities. Rebecca Martinez and her son Jake became key witnesses in the federal case, with Tommy serving as a victim advocate who helped Jake understand the legal process and provided emotional support during interviews with federal investigators. The friendship between the boys became a powerful symbol of how children could support each other through adult-created crises while maintaining their sense of justice and hope for positive outcomes. The Heritage Property Solutions investigation ultimately exposed a criminal network involving 12 property management companies across 4 states, with total theft estimates exceeding $8 million. Rebecca's case provided the civil rights violations that triggered federal intervention, while our documentation of the targeting strategy gave prosecutors evidence of conspiracy and racketeering charges that would send the perpetrators to prison. For decades, 6 months after Rebecca's initial phone call, Heritage Property Solutions was dissolved by federal court order. Summit Development Corporation filed for bankruptcy, and 15 individuals were indicted on charges ranging from mail fraud to civil rights violations. Rebecca and Jake remained in their home with full access to the community amenities they'd paid for, while Jake's therapeutic equipment was officially recognized as medical accommodation that couldn't be restricted by arbitrary community standards. Sunset Springs Community Advocacy Center had evolved from a local resource helping individual families into a regional organization that assisted federal investigators in exposing systematic property management fraud. Our success rate in protecting vulnerable families had attracted attention from other communities dealing with similar schemes, and requests for consultation had grown to the point where we needed additional staff and expanded facilities. But the most important transformation was personal. Tommy had discovered his calling as an advocate for children whose families were being targeted by adult criminals who mistook vulnerability for weakness. His natural sense of justice, combined with research skills and organizational abilities that impressed federal investigators, made him uniquely effective at helping other kids understand that fighting corruption was both possible and necessary. Every evening, when Tommy and I reviewed the day's casework from our home office that had once been Karen Whitfield's criminal command center, we'd remember the lesson that had started everything. Sometimes protecting one family means saving an entire community. And sometimes the most effective weapon against organized crime is an organized response that puts justice ahead of profit. 5 years later, Tommy and I stood on the deck of our home, watching families enjoy the community pool that Karen Whitfield had tried to steal. The Sunset Springs Community Advocacy Center had helped over 500 families across 6 states, recovering more than $12 million in fraudulent fees, and sending 47 corrupt property managers to prison. Tommy, now 13, already talking about law school, had just finished his first paid consultation with a family from Phoenix whose HOA was targeting military veterans. "Dad," he said, organizing his case files with the same methodical precision his mother had taught him, "I think we should start teaching other kids how to fight corruption too. Adults miss things that kids notice right away." The idea was brilliant. Typically Tommy, we launched the Young Advocates program 6 months later, teaching children across the country how to recognize fraud, document evidence, and support their families through bureaucratic harassment. The program's motto, suggested by Tommy, was simple: fair is fair, no matter how old you are. Karen Whitfield was released from federal prison last month after serving 8 years of her 12-year sentence. She now works at a convenience store in Nebraska, her criminal record ensuring she never again hold authority over community resources. Her former mansion continues serving families who need help fighting the same type of predators she once was. The community pool still hosts Tommy's swimming lessons, Mrs. Patterson's water therapy, and Mr. Rodriguez's veteran support group meetings. But now it also represents something larger: proof that families can defeat organized crime when they work together, document everything, and refuse to let bullies win through intimidation. What would you have done if corrupt officials targeted your family? Drop a comment sharing your HOA horror stories. Your experience might help other families recognize similar scams. Where are you watching from? I want to see how many communities are dealing with property management corruption. Hit that subscribe button for more justice served content, because when families stand together and children speak truth to power, criminals don't stand a chance. Remember, sometimes the smallest voices expose the biggest corruption.